everyone. You're listening to The Future of Food Is You, a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. I'm your host, Abena Anim-Somuah, and each week I talk to emerging talents in the food world, and they share what they're up to, as well as their dreams and predictions for what's ahead. I love this new generation of chefs, bakers, and creatives making their way in the world of food, drink, media, and tech. Today's guest is Ella Quittner, the journalist behind some of the most buzzed about writing in food media. She's making a name for herself with pieces like her New York Times article, I Love You, But I Hate Your Cooking, and The Bizarre Allure of Sexy Cakes in New York Magazine. You might be surprised to learn that Ella spent years working in finance before pivoting to a freelance writing career. We chat about how she made that jump and how she landed in her first full-time editorial gig. Ella talks about how she learned to pitch to media outlets and her methods for keeping track of her ideas, plus her observations on the state of food media today. Stay tuned for our chat. The next issue of Cherry Bomb's print magazine is almost here, and it's all about the city of the summer, Paris. Whether you're planning a trip to Paris or daydreaming about a future visit, you'll love this issue. Get recommendations from folks like Molly Boss and friend of the pod, Zainab Issa. Learn about the coolest Parisians on the food scene, and check out the fun Frenchy recipes to add to your repertoire. You can subscribe now at cherrybomb.com or pick up an issue at your favorite local bookstore, magazine shop, or gourmet store. Places like Casa Magazines in New York City, Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Massachusetts, and Omnivore Books in San Francisco. Or visit cherrybomb.com to order an issue today.
Hi, everybody. This is Kerry Diamond from Radio Cherry Bomb. We are hosting a special event in Las Vegas this Monday, June 24th from 6 to 8 p.m. Join me and some of the city's top female culinary talent to celebrate our new podcast miniseries, Destination Cherry Bomb, which is dedicated to all things food and travel. We'll have networking, a panel conversation, and great food and drink. We'll be at the beautiful La Fontaine restaurant located inside Fontainebleau, Las Vegas. Come meet other members of the Vegas Bomb Squad and learn about the folks shaping the city's culinary landscape. Tickets are $30 and include the latest issue of Cherry Bomb magazine, plus all bites and sips. Head to cherrybomb.com to get your tickets today, or check out the link in our show notes.
Now, let's check in with today's guest. Ella, thank you so much for joining us on the Future Food Is You podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Can you tell us where you grew up and how did food show up in your life?
Sure. I grew up back and forth on the East Coast and West Coast, so I was raised partially in Long Island and then partially in a sort of strange pocket of Northern California outside of San Francisco. And how did food show up in my life? I mean, it showed up in the conventional ways. I grew up in this sort of like Philip Rothian anxiety field, like anxiety was our religion sort of family of very tightly wound, type A, neurotic parents and children. And I think food showed up in a way that was almost medicinal for us, not in like the nice way where it's like food is medicine, plants are medicine, etc.
Yeah.
Which like totally love now. Food was like the thing that grounded us, right? We could all be spiraling or disagreeing or things could be chaotic. You know, we could all have different opinions about a thing, or I could be freaking out and melting down about this thing, my sister about another thing, my other sister about another thing, my parents not even home from work yet. And then the thing that would kind of ground us and center us as a family was having one of a few meals that were sort of like recurring characters in our lives.
I love that.
The same sort of like chicken dish, or my parents made this thing, which was like, they would just boil spaghetti or bucatini. It was spaghetti. I don't know why I'm pretending I'm fancy. And then they would get like cold polio ricotta, basically, spread that on a plate, twirl the hot pasta onto it, but not mix it in. Put like a nest of, I think they had just discovered palmy boxed tomato sauce. So like a nest of that sort of doctored a little bit in the like 20 minutes after they got home from work because they worked kind of late. They would do that a lot. That was a really grounding one.
You have one of the most impressive resumes in food. You have bylines in some of the most prominent publications. You're working on a cookbook. You're a recipe developer. But that was not your first foray out of college. You actually had a career in finance before food. What were you working on, and did you take any lessons from that time into the world of food?
Yes, I spent the better part of a decade working in finance, working on Wall Street. The sort of technical description of what I was doing was raising capital for private equity fund managers. As we were a sort of smaller group within an investment bank. And so practically what that looked like is sort of how it looks for Hollywood agents or managers to sort of operate with their clients. At least that's how I see it now that I'm on the writing side of things, where we would work with basically the managers of these private equity funds from the inception of their idea to raise a fund through helping them create all the marketing about it and the description. And then we would set up the meetings for them to meet with potential investors and go with them to the meetings and help convince investors that they should, invest
That's
in
a lot
these
of different
funds.
functions.
Yeah. Sometimes the projects would last like 3 years. Sometimes they were like 6 months, but it was never short. I mean, I think every job is useful. To be honest, I've brought lessons learned from my 4 or 5 years as a barista in high school to my day-to-day life too.
Course.
And, from getting fired as a babysitter and a tutor to my day-to-day life.
Yeah.
I think the main things from my time in finance were working at a very fast pace, meeting deadlines, managing a lot of balls in the air because the way the business was structured, you could be on anywhere from 3 to 6 deals, meaning 3 to 6 disparate clients around the world whom you were raising money for. And you had to make all of them feel like they were your only client. Working on teams, learning to manage people is really helpful, even though I'm a freelancer now. So it's almost the opposite, but just kind of understanding those relational dynamics is useful. And I think in a weird way, burning out at times in Wall Street or in finance kind of helped me understand the way I as a person am inclined to work and the way I am a person am inclined to really seek external validation. And even if I can't totally control it still, I think just that the growing up I did in that job and the sort of like introspection I was forced to do at certain moments when I was teetering on the brink of like, it's 1 a.m. and nothing feels possible and everything feels like it's going to go wrong if I don't do all this stuff. And like, having the requisite people say to you, like,
please fix.
You're not an open heart surgeon. You're not, like, let's take a step back. That sort of emotional lesson I think is useful for me now since I juggle a lot of different jobs.
Yeah. You leave finance, but while you were in finance, you had started freelance writing a bit. How would you describe your writing style to those who are unfamiliar with your work?
Broadly, I would say I write about culture. Often that involves food, but not always. And then as much as I would like to be writing the sort of hard-hitting, investigations that are like changing lives and all of this, I think what I tend to write about, and maybe in the future I will do some of those. I hope to one day. That would be cool. Yeah, I'm going to manifest that. But I tend to write more things that I would consider amusing or entertaining. So I think the big things across all the mediums I write in, fiction, nonfiction, journalism, screenwriting, is that I like to make people laugh and I like to make them feel things. I would say I like to make them cry, but I don't mean like I like to bully them. I mean I like to make them feel in touch with the things that make us human and why that can be beautiful and why that can be hard and why it can be confusing.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Looking for some fun things to do this summer? Check out Cherry Bomb Summer Series. The Cherry Bomb team is hitting the road from Portland, Maine to Portland, Oregon for special dinners, networking events, and even Women Who Grill celebrations. Learn more and get tickets at cherrybomb.com. So you are a freelancer, and I think that's how most people get to approach your work, but you've had one full-time job in food where you worked at Food 52 as a writer and recipe developer. How did you get that job coming out of finance and transitioning into the food world?
I'm sure most people have a similar answer to this, which is that I applied for like probably dozens of jobs over the course of maybe 2 years. I realized a few years into finance that I was much more interested in who had made the bagels that someone brought in when we were all hungover that sat on the little like table in the middle of the bullpen than I was in the day in and day out machinations of like the markets. Not to say I wasn't trying to keep up with that, just that if someone started talking about the best burger in an office near my sad little cubicle, I was like, that I was eavesdropping on.
Yeah.
But it took a minute. I applied to a lot of jobs. I applied to jobs at Bon Appetit. I remember I applied to multiple jobs at The Infatuation, which at the time was like red hot, growing, nascent. Yes. I applied to, oh gosh, I've like blocked it from my memory because there's just so much rejection.
Those no's hit hard.
Those no's, I still face rejection all the time, and it doesn't get much easier. Yeah, I applied to a lot of jobs, and then I finally applied to this one at Food 52. I can't remember if it was the first job I had applied to at Food 52 or if I had already applied to a job and done the whole rigmarole of going on LinkedIn and Instagram and
the cold emails.
Yeah, going through my resume and everyone I've ever met or gone to college with. I guess the way I got that job was twofold. One was I just kind of knocked on every door I could of people who could potentially connect me into the hiring process, because I remember a big thing at that time, food media was blowing up. This was like 2018.
Okay. Oh, that was a season.
This was like people were posting their cappuccinos on Instagram story and writing "copped." And like, I'd love to say I was rolling my eyes, but no, I was like sprinting to
You were right there with them.
the East Village to get that cappuccino so I could write on my Instagram story, which had like 30 followers, "copped." Yeah, like fully I was like an acolyte of whatever the strange cult they were building
The
was.
test kitchen.
Claire was like reverse engineering a Twinkie. I was like wrapped. I was like, shut up. I'm busy. I'm working. And my bosses were like, no, but yeah. So I remember that was going on. I was very acutely aware that at a lot of these places, probably my applications weren't even getting read. So I knocked on as many doors as I could to try to just get my application read at Food 52. I remember at least I had a friend whose neighbor and friend, who's now a friend of mine, confusing, had in some way been involved at the inception of Food 52. So I got them to put in a good word for me. I think I ghost wrote an email about myself, actually, that was like, Ella is so amazing. Every time we run into her, we're just floored by how insightful she is. And by the way, the olive oil cake she makes, we think about constantly, and we beg her to make it for us. And like basically convince them to forward that to someone. Things like that.
Yeah.
And also, I think it helped that I'd been reading Food 52 since it was born.
I was
like a deep fan of Krista McGlory's column, Genius Recipes.
Yes.
So that was one way just to get my application read. And then the second way was when you apply to editorial jobs, you have to do something called an edit test.
Yes.
Which is you're basically given a series of prompts that require you, if you're applying to be a writer, to invent a lot of ideas and pitches and then write some sample headlines, write some sample captions or sample paragraphs, or write some sample features depending on what you're applying to. Or if you're applying to be an editor somewhere, the edit test might be that they're giving you
something to edit.
Yeah, exactly. A freelancer piece that ran or didn't run, and they just want you to redline it in Google Docs or whatever.
Yeah.
So for Food 52, I remember I was like, there's no way, I face so much rejection. There's no way anyone wants to hire me, whatever. I threw my hat in the ring. I'm probably never going to hear from them. I remember I was getting on an airplane to go to the bachelorette party of a friend, and I wouldn't have Wi-Fi for like 6 days. The bachelorette party was overseas. This will become important. And so I get on the plane, I get on the red eye, I'm in row like 48 of 47. I'm like literally my seat is the bathroom and it's already clogged. And I look at my email one last time. And I'm also so email triggered at this point in my life already because I'm still in finance. I haven't had that email up. I'm constantly checking it. I'm already nervous I'm going to be offline for 3 days or whatever. I'm already scheming of how I can go to a Wi-Fi cafe. And I have an email from the hiring editor, and she's like, hey, so here's an edit test. Would you be able to complete this and turn it in to us by Monday? This is like a Thursday, I think, at like 11 p.m., right?
Did you bring your laptop at least?
Sorry, I'm laughing because at this time in my life, my friends just relentlessly trolled me because I didn't go anywhere without not one but 2 laptops. My personal laptop, which was like, some old beat up Mac that I was using to apply to all these jobs, and also in my humiliating, burgeoning, and now failed and hidden career as a stand-up comedian. And, to send all these cold pitches and whatever and do my double life. And then my work laptop, which was like a horrible, like Lenovo PC. Yeah, that was like 14 inches thick and 14 inches wide. Yeah, it was horrible. So I was like clunking around everywhere with constant back pain. So I did have both laptops, and I got the email and I was like, oh, shoot. I'm going to have to just make it work without Wi-Fi. So on the plane, I have like 2 seconds before we take off. I go to Food 52's website because the big thing in edit test is you don't want to repeat any content they've already done. So I don't even have time to think about stuff. I'm just blindly screenshotting like hundreds of recipe pages, hundreds of like stories, whatever. I can literally screenshot on my phone before we take off. I'm like, okay, whatever I didn't get, I'll just go to an internet cafe and figure out. Or when I figure out my ideas, I'll go to an internet cafe and make sure they don't already have it. We land. I'm like, okay, it's 6 a.m. on day 1. I'm just going to wake up early because I don't want to disappoint my friend and just do the application for 3 hours every day. Oh, and sorry, it also involved developing recipes. So in addition to like the ideas, the pitches, and the features, it was like literally turn in 3 full recipes. That was like the main part of it.
Wow.
I had to write recipes from scratch, and I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do because I can't test these.
Had you been doing recipe development at that time?
Not professionally. I had done it in my life, but
okay.
not in a way where I was like, well, I can just grab these 3 off the shelf that didn't get published by
Yeah.
whatever other publication.
Mm-hmm.
So I get there, and then there's a big complication,
Oh, dear.
which is I don't remember what it was, but there was some legislation at the time that made it so Food 52 couldn't be accessed in Europe. I wasn't aware of it, so I kind of just had to do it blind. And then at a certain point, I wrote the recipes and I begged people, I think my parents, maybe my sisters, maybe some friends who weren't with me, to cross-test the recipes at home and also check the website for me to make sure I wasn't straight up copying anything or duplicating it.
So it seems like you got to understand writing and recipe developing, and if anything, all of this is just a testament to the persistence of being a freelance writer. So once you leave Food 52, it sounds like you didn't spend too much time there in hindsight relative to your career. What motivated you to transition into freelance writing, where you are now?
I knew that I wanted to also pursue screenwriting and fiction writing and kind of nonfiction writing, journalism about culture, or kind of essays, reported essays, travel writing, all the stuff I do now. And so it felt like the best way to do that was to transition to a freelance relationship now that I'd built up kind of a editor situation at Food 52. I knew I could pitch someone there. It felt like it might be the right time to take that leap. But it was 3 or 4 months before the pandemic hit. So it was actually kind of insane timing in retrospect and not the right time to do that.
But it worked out.
Yeah, I'm sure I would have, wherever I was, gotten laid off anyway. So
from your perspective right now, what is the current landscape of food writing as it exists in the media?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, I think there's a few different threads that come to mind. One is, where are we and where are we going? One trend I see a lot is that I think that in all media, we're kind of transitioning culturally. And I don't mean this in legacy publications. I mean in a supply-demand, what we're consuming way. I think we're transitioning a little bit to a situation in which we're much more personality focused. And we have been for years, right? You and I were joking earlier about loving the Bon Appetit test kitchen.
Yes.
And we were loving that for the personalities, not necessarily because it was
everyone had
part
their
of a
favorite
legacy. The internet just gave us another way to worship celebrities that we think in some weird subconscious way are relatable to us, even though when we meet them, they're most often not. That's just getting exponentially more and more intimate and more intense with things like Instagram Reels and TikTok and the continued growth of YouTube and the way these creator programs are incentivizing people to go viral. So I think that's one thread I see, which is that food media and all media, it's not fully transitioning to an individual or personality-based thing where folks are just TikToking about stuff, but that's a lot of where our attention is. And then I think people do still sort of have a yearning for trust for certain legacy publications across the field of media. The other thing that comes to mind about your question, you said, where do you see food media in the landscape of overall media? Something I see a lot is that at certain publications, I see that places that cover a number of topics, that have a number of beats, whether it's an old magazine or what have you, the people in charge have started to realize, it seems like, as an outsider, I have no insight into this, fully a freelancer, but it seems like they've started to realize how valuable food coverage is.
1,000%.
I think 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, whatever, I'm just going to keep saying numbers of years to seem intelligent. Since the dawn of time, I think that maybe food was thought of as something that was lower hanging fruit in the writing space, and things like art, fashion, books, literature, theater, world news, all those thought of as a bit higher brow, a bit more literary, or if not more literary, more intellectual. And I think that in a certain sense, we kind of did it. I can't take much credit for that. I haven't been around very long, but the leaders of food media, the people who've been writing these beautiful pieces about how important food is to culture and how food brings us together and tears us apart and makes us want to live and makes us want to die or saves us when we're dying or brings us back to life, whatever it is. All of these stories about food have really done the trick, and I think have convinced people who needed to be convinced that. And also, I think, money is kind of telling a story, right?
Where are people's eyeballs going? Where their wallets going?
Exactly.
Totally.
Where's ad revenue coming from? Who are people following on YouTube? You see this a lot. I don't know if it's indicative of a larger trend, but something I see a lot is a major celebrity in another field, like a movie star or something, will start doing cooking videos on TikTok or Instagram. There's definitely an argument to be made that some of that's just organic, because part of the reason you and I love food and reading about food and writing about food is because it's so important and so integral.
I eagerly look out for your bylines. I think you write in some of the publications I'm a loyal subscriber to, and a lot of your writing, especially in the last couple of months, has focused a lot on cultural observations of restaurant and food phenomenons, from the prominence of butter as this idea, this movement, this artistic representation, to the functionality of chore coats as waiter uniforms. What is your approach to finding relevant topics to write about as food intersects with culture?
If something that I encounter out in the world, or even just in the confines of my home, if anything makes me want to pick up my phone and send a text message to a friend or family member that is, I'll just say, spirited. If I'm like, want to pick up my phone and do a little rant about something, or if I want to pick up my phone and say, have you noticed this? It's sort of insane. Or what is going on with this? Or if I'm screenshotting something and I'm sending it to someone to say, this is driving me wild.
Yeah.
That's usually a pretty big indicator. That may not be the angle, right? But that's usually a good indicator to me that there's something going on. There's something in the ether that I want to pluck out and look at a little more closely. Like most people alive in 2024, I keep an insane number of iPhone notes that are half finished. And one of them is just a long-running list of things that I've noticed, food or otherwise. It's not like everything I notice, like person in yellow coat, but it's like
seeing patterns,
yeah,
or seeing trends,
exactly,
observations,
weird trends, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm getting a drink to kill time and I notice a table at this strange dive bar is ordered like a tableside flambe, and then I'm like, is tableside flambe back? So I'll write down the example. And
dinner
then,
theatrics, there's a whole theme around that.
Exactly.
Totally.
And then maybe I encounter it again 4 months later and I've completely forgotten about it. I go to write that in the note again and I'm like, oh,
there it is.
And, you know, people talk a lot about the rule of three. Like if
Yes.
if you see 3 instances of a thing, it's a trend. You need to not just have the rule of 3, but also kind of take a minute with yourself and say, is there some bigger cultural reason why this is happening? Can I connect this into other ideas I'm having about what's going on in society, inflation, what's going on with the economy?
How do you develop relationship with editors of these publications to sort of bring these ideas and observations you have to life?
There's probably a more composed answer to this that involves things like networking and that sort of thing, which is probably true, and I'll come back to. But the honest answer to how I was able to eventually get things placed at some of these publications is, I would say 75 or more % of the time, is incessant cold pitching.
But it's the reality.
Yeah, I did do a lot of cold pitching for a long time. I think the practical things that helped eventually land ideas, there are a few things. One was getting some bylines. And I was lucky that when I was in college, before I went into finance, I had done some internships thinking I might want to work in journalism.
Interesting.
So I had some bylines from places like health.com, which was a website for Health Magazine or that kind of thing, which is useful because when you're cold pitching people, especially very early in your career, you really want to have that stuff to be able to say, you can take a risk on me because someone else has, and I did the thing that you have to do. But yeah, a lot of cold pitching that eventually over time got slightly better.
Yeah, and I think that's
great.
There's a beauty in consistency, and I'm sure within time you found your voice. You've kind of drawn feedback together. Are you getting assigned pitches, and is there a balance between what you're getting assigned by these editors and what you're pitching to them as something you're seeing out in the world?
There's definitely a balance, and I love getting assigned pitches because
Homework.
I really like collaborating with a lot of the people I work with. Like some of the editors I get to write for are some of my favorite people on earth, and they're so smart and they're funny. And I love when they're like, hey, here's a trend. Do you have a take on it? Because it's sort of like being in a writer's room or just riffing with your best friend. It's like, oh, now that you mention it, I do. So I really like that. And a lot of the ideas I get from editors I work with, I do take because a lot of it's people who I already trust and love working with, right? It's not just like, a PR email that's like, have you ever thought about writing about
so-and-so
exactly
brand thing?
Yeah, how
Totally.
like shrimp is delicious.
I'm curious to hear, just being so connected to these publications, has there been something that surprised you about the mechanisms of food media publications as they exist today, based on your observations as a freelance writer?
I think the number one thing, and this is going to reveal my just like deep-seated insecurity if I haven't already, I'm still constantly taken aback by the sort of respectfulness in the way that editors will take you seriously. once you've agreed that you are going to write about a thing, once they've accepted a pitch or what have you, the idea that they're treating me like a real person who has input on a thing and or is an expert on a thing that I've researched is like so intoxicating and so validating in a weird way, I guess.
Yeah.
Coming from an industry where I was like really climbing up the ladder and it felt really endless. And I am, by the way, still doing that in other industries like screenwriting.
Of course. Yeah.
Literally nobody.
Everyone's constantly growing.
Yeah. And so I think going into a situation where someone is actually taking you seriously and it's like, what do you think about this? What do you think the headline should be? I've made some edits, but do you like them? Or can you maybe elaborate on this? Or do you have more ideas about this? Is just, for me, it's just catnip. And it's like why I can't imagine having a different job. It feels so good to be surprised by someone wanting to hear what I think about a thing.
That's really powerful. And that's really nice to hear that, you go from having this difficult relationship, getting an editor to notice you, to like,
Exactly.
you finally reaching their line of sight and them being like, oh, I see this sort of camaraderie, this reciprocity and building something together. That's really special.
I think that is why it's so jarring. You just articulated it really well. It's because you spend years and years trying to convince anyone to just open your email.
Read your words.
Like,
of course.
Open your follow-up email that you've just like carefully crafted with the help of 6 of your best friends to seem carefree and
we love a crisis calm
legit.
group chat.
Yeah, literally. And then, it's so shocking when it's like, okay, yeah, we're listening. What do you have to say?
What do you think the future holds for food media? And how do you think people like you as freelance writers are playing a role in shaping that?
I think that there's a balance. We'll strike eventually a harmony between personality-driven content, I'll call it, instead of media, because I'm not talking about just sort of, I guess videos are media. So I think it's a harmony, a balance between personality-driven stuff and then folks kind of deciding collectively like how much institutional backing they're seeking and what percent of the content they're consuming they want to have that, because it's not something we crave all the time.
No.
I don't need an institutional backer if I'm trying to scroll on TikTok to find out what the best primer is to put under my makeup. I just want to kind of see how it looks on people's faces in different light. I want to see a consensus of like all the stuff they're recommending. So I think it's a balance between that. And it's ultimately, I think, up to the consumers, us and everyone else, readers, watchers, viewers, subscribers. I think Substack is an interesting space to watch and an interesting trend predictor in that sense. Because, we're also sort of starting to see the institutionalization of Substack a little bit. Right now, we're paying for the ones we want to read, et cetera. But I think probably we're going to start to see Substack imitating a traditional magazine a little bit for a while, or a traditional blog or a zine, where you and I get together because we have a lot of the same readers. And we're like, instead of charging $5 to every reader every month, like maybe you, me, and someone else get together and they pay $9, but we only have to write 1 in 4, right?
Exactly.
So I think we're going to see stuff like that. And that's going to be a weird way we're seeing that equilibrium between institutions and individuals. Because what even is an institution? Are you, me, and one other person who are running a Substack not an editorial board?
Of course.
Do we not have a policy? Do we not like vote and talk about what we write about, what we don't, what our ethical guidelines are about press strips, et cetera?
I want to transition into your recipe development side. I think you're one of the writers that sort of has this balance of, writing bylines, but also you have these recipe concepts and things that you develop. You post these really awesome, visually aesthetic projects on your Instagram where you basically take a baking sheet, line it up with some washi tape, and you take a food, let's say a pancake, and you show us these different iterations of the pancake, either with coconut oil, butter, AP flour, cake flour, which has this almost beautiful scientific yet home economics vibe to it. And you call these concepts head-to-heads. How did you come up with this idea?
I came up with the idea through my own neuroticism. I think at some point I looked around and was like, this is the sort of thing I'm doing anyway. Everyone else doesn't have to do this too. This takes forever. I'm doing it. Let me do the work and let me post the results and let me just sort of tell you what I'm thinking. And by the way, the project is called The Best and the Rest, and it's about this sort of obsession with finding the best way to cook things, where I'm melding tips and tricks and techniques and recipes from all these different things I'm testing. But I also very much firmly believe that there is no such thing as the best, and that context is really important to anyone's understanding of the best. And so another piece of the project for me is, this is my perspective. I'm testing 20 different ways to make a biscuit, and I'm going to tell you what I think the best recipe is based on all of that. but with my own mission in mind, which is, for me, I really love a biscuit to be super layered and flaky and a little sweet and get kind of a caramelized bottom, and it can lean savory if you put ham in it. It can lean sweet. It can be the top of a cobbler. It can be all of these different things. That's what I like in a biscuit. So I really endeavor also to conceptualize each of these head-to-heads with that kind of context. So
and it's also interesting. It seems like for some of them, you're following the same recipe, but just with variations, which I think is just a testament to recipes. Recipes are guides. They're ways for you to try out and build your own relationship to food. But then you also have ones where you sort of take a chocolate chip cookie and then you've done different versions of different recipes of people's chocolate chip cookies. So you've done like the King Arthur chocolate chip cookie, or you've done, the Pillsbury cookie cookbook, and you've done, the New York Times one. And it's really interesting to sort of see you take that comparative concept and bring it out in these different ways. Do you cook each batch of the recipe, or do you sort of make samples to then display out?
It depends on the item. So something, and it depends on how flexible it is. So in the book, there's a chapter on yellow cakes. That's an example of something I could only scale down to be half recipes pretty much if I wanted to be able to get a clean slice of yellow cake that didn't feel like it was confused in the pan because I'd scaled it down so far it was just a muffin or whatever.
Of course.
But I really hate food waste. So I tend to try to scale things down as much as possible or pick flexible bases that I'm then manipulating toward the end. Like an example of that is vodka sauce. You could kind of start with not with every single test, but for as many of them as possible, right? You can start with an allium base, divide it into 4 pots, and then add different amounts of tomato paste and vodka or whatever. The ones that were the hardest to scale for the book were definitely yellow cake, certain frostings actually, certain buttercreams, because when you're making a meringue, of course, you need a certain volume to be able to actually aerate the eggs properly and get the right results with the sugar syrups and butter and things. Roast chicken. Although I want to shout out Mia Glickman, who helped me with a lot of the head-to-head testing behind the scenes in my kitchen, who's amazing. And we did it with a lot of chicken pieces and parts. So we couldn't scale down every test because some were like, how does it affect it if you spatchcock a whole chicken versus just roast it straight up versus just truss it but leave it unspatchcocked? So those 3, for example, had to be whole chickens. But for a lot of the trials, we would just use like a thigh connected to a drumstick.
I'm curious to hear how the head-to-head style has informed your cooking and harness your relationship to food in general.
Ooh, I think equal and opposite reactions. One is that I'm like very obsessive naturally and very neurotic naturally, if that's not clear at this point in the podcast. So it is always sort of playing on like a ticker tape in my mind. If a friend is like, I'm coming over, let's make cookies, let's make chicken or whatever. I'm like, okay, I gotta... I know the things that will make it the best chicken for my palate. So I have to kind of get those things ready and be ready to do those steps. The sort of opposite reaction is I think I'm really burnt out on cooking right now.
Of course, you've been developing a cookbook.
Sure, but it would be better if I was like carefree and walking in grass barefoot. I don't know how I would have access to grass, but if I had access to grass, I'd be walking through it barefoot.
Prospect Park.
Gingham apron, carrying like a beautiful tray of like a thing I made casually to my beautiful friends who love me and think it's delicious.
Sun is setting.
The sun's
birds
setting.
are chirping.
There's like a cloudy raspberry-colored wine. The reality is most nights my husband and I make something we call slop, which is like absolutely disgusting. We just kind of take what's in the fridge and like saute it for a really long time.
Love.
And I'll like kind of give it a name to try to be generous and gentle with myself. Like last night I did uncased Italian chicken sausage, a lot of kale that I just had that was on its very last legs, sort of like puree I had made earlier in the week of pecorino and more kale that I'd blanched.
This is a very exquisite slop.
Well, it didn't look it. And old rice. I always have really old rice. And so I put a lot of that in there. And then I had a leftover broth because I had made Sola's Hainanese-ish. I think it's called chicken.
Yes.
Or it's called like kind of Hainanese chicken.
It's such a good recipe.
Hainanese. I'd saved the poaching liquid, so I used that as a broth. And what I made is really scary looking and tasting. Yeah, I think the way it's affected me is like in my own life, when I am burnt out, I really cannot do more than one pot. I have to use just like one cutting board, one knife, one spoon.
One element on the stove.
Oh, God, if that.
We've been hinting at this, but let's talk about the cookbook, The Best and the Rest, that's set to come out next spring. Congratulations. That's really
Thank
exciting.
you.
And you describe it as a culinary exploration of America's obsession with the best. What inspired you to write the book?
I think I've been obsessed with this nebulous idea of the best. I say that in scare quotes for basically as long as I can remember, right? I was a child that didn't even know what the word validation was, but I craved it so deeply from my teachers, my parents, my siblings, whatever. And then, in every one of my kind of lives that I say that like I have like a million novels in me, like my past lives, but, in my college life, in my Wall Street life, in my Food 52 life, in my post Food 52, just screenwriting, writing, journalism life, whatever. I think that's been a really guiding principle, even though I haven't wanted to accept it. And funnily enough, when I pitched this book concept, I really did it in the third person, I guess is what you would call it. I don't know if that's right. But I said, I want to write this book about the American obsession with the best, or why certain people are obsessed with the best, and why if you say this is the best way to do something, everyone's going to want to click it, and everyone wants to know the best everything. But it took me until maybe like 3 days before I turned in a rough draft of my manuscript, which was really recently, to be like, no, it's me. I'm part of this. I've been obsessed with this forever.
Obsessed with the
Yeah,
best.
I am. I really am. I can't walk past a thing that says this is the best thing. I can't walk past a person who is training and throwing everything into trying to be the best at something. I can't walk past like a eating competition. I can't walk past any billboard that's promising the best way to get a deal on a thing. And so I think what inspired the project was both that innate urge that I've always had, and then also my kind of classic self-critical outlook where I really wanted to analyze why I'm the way I am, right? I wanted to follow people, places, things around who were also obsessed with the best, to try to understand the cultural urge, whether it's American or whether it's sort of ubiquitous, to be the best, know the best, eat the best. I wanted both pieces. So it's a little meta.
I love
because
that.
you are still getting my cooking
Yeah.
tips for like the best way to cook chicken.
Of course, but there's a deeper meaning behind it.
I hope so.
Yeah. Well, tell us about the collection of recipes that readers will expect when the book comes out next year.
So every recipe is based on these head-to-heads I did. I did a juicy shrimp head-to-head where my goal was to find a way to make the juiciest shrimp. After that head-to-head where I tell you about the results and what worked and what didn't and what tips and tricks and whatever. And by the way, a lot of that is intel that I just got through research that work other people did. I want to be very clear to give credit
Yeah, of course.
everywhere. And
You're
I tried to
comparing
in the book.
best. Yeah.
Right. But a lot
As
of
it
that is
exists.
stuff I found in XYZ cookbook or XYZ blog or this person did it. So there's, a very fulsome list of references in there. Pretty much none of this is something that I thought of independently. So I test all this stuff and I write up the results, and then I develop recipes based on what suited my mission and my preferences the most. So for juicy shrimp, the method that I found gave the most sort of like, when I combine this factor, and this factor, as far as how to brine the shrimp, how to cook the shrimp, how to whatever, whether it's head on, shell on, etc., what made it the most sort of succulent and kind of melty and juicy,
Yeah.
almost like when you get a fresh, uncooked shrimp and a piece of nigiri or something like that quality of shrimp, but in a shrimp cocktail.
Yes.
So I give you a recipe for that. And then I have recipes that are also spin-offs, right? Either there are other methods where it's
Yeah.
like, yes, that's the best way to do it for me, but here's a quicker way.
Yeah.
Or they're just recipes where you can use kind of, here's that shrimp that's prepared in XYZ way, but now you can use it in this new way to make a dip or whatever it is.
How do you hope people will feel when they read the book? And how do you hope bringing the book out into the world will influence and shape cooking culture as we know it?
I hope they'll feel delighted and amused.
Yeah.
I hope that they laugh a lot. I hope that they feel things. It's the same with all the writing I try to do. I want to make people laugh and I want to make them feel feelings. And I hope that they bring their existing kind of love for cooking and their existing love for how to do things to the book. And then I hope they learn some new things. And then I hope they get mad at me and tell me it was all wrong and tell me new ways to do things so that in book 2 and book 3, I can try those new ways and realize like I had a huge blind spot and actually there are all these other better ways to do things I didn't even test.
Yeah.
So I hope that that it contributes to, it gives us something to talk about and it opens a dialogue around cooking that I personally really enjoy, that feels familiar to me, like bickering with my sisters in the back of my parents' Honda in 1994.
What advice would you give to someone who simply just wants to improve their writing?
I guess the advice I would give would just be to read everything. I love to read, and I love to read out of the genres I write in, and I love to just consume content. That, to me, I find the most inspirational and also the most helpful in understanding what my voice is and what I like to write about. Because when you read things, sometimes you read something that's so good and it's so you're almost jealous. You're like, I wish I wrote that. That's
Yes.
really good information. And then sometimes you read something and you're like, that was incredible, so smart, loved it. Never could have come out of my brain, ever. Also very good information. And that goes down to kind of the nitty-gritty of sentence structure. Sometimes you read a sentence and you're like, oh, I love that sentence. I
Yeah.
wish I wrote a sentence like that. That's all really helpful, right? It's kind of like if you didn't know what food you kind of liked to cook or eat, so you went out and ate a lot of food. It's just all good information.
Yes.
And it's very pleasurable in the process, and you're also learning interesting things in the process.
As a writer and cultural commentator, based on what you've seen out there and what you're writing, how do you hope that your work shapes the future of food writing and the narratives that we've established about food and culture?
For me as a kid, as like a weird, lonely kid that was often like friendless or often just going off and doing weird sort of mad scientist vibe things, I think art was really important, not food media. I mean, I was, 6. Like the internet barely was what it is today. But I just mean in the sense of art, like songs I liked that I would listen to or books that I would get into or movies, etc. I think good art was important to me because it made me feel less lonely. Like I have this memory of being a preteen or teenager and reading Dubliners, the James Joyce collection.
Great book.
At the end, there's a sentence that's like, his eyes burned with anguish and anger, and he was driven and derided by vanity. It's some sentence like that with like a parallel structure with a lot of sort of beautiful description in it. I just remember being so moved, like my face got really hot and my eyes filled with tears, and like that didn't really happen to me. I'm so cynical, and like I said, I grew up in this very tense, humorous, deflection, neurotic, funny, but not emotional family. I have memories like that of, hearing like a Frightened Rabbit song or watching a film or TV show and just feeling like maybe I wasn't as alone in the world as I kind of thought I was day in and day out if other people had had these experiences, which were actually universal. So I guess I hope that one day, whether it's this cookbook, whether it's the novel I'm working on, whether it's something that hasn't popped into my brain yet, that I can contribute something to the canon of art that's out there that makes people feel like maybe they're not so alone in the human experience.
Ella, thank you so much for this conversation. I'm excited to keep seeing your bylines in my favorite publications, and I can't wait for your cookbook to come out. If we wanted to continue to support you, where are the best places to find you?
Oh, there's not that many places to find me. I think the best place to find me maybe is Instagram. My handle is @Quittner, my first initial and last name.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Before we go, our guest is going to leave a voicemail just talking to themselves 10 years from now. You have reached the Future of Food as You mailbox. Please leave your message after the beep.
Hi, Ella. It's 10 years ago. What's trending on TikTok is people eating a lot of protein. You just watched Baby Reindeer. Talking to 10 years in the future, I guess the one thing I want to remind you of that feels weirdly prescient now is that last week you interviewed a wellness expert, the mother of mindfulness, she's called on the internet. And she told you that stress is invented. It's something we invent, she said, and it requires two things. One is the anticipation that an event will happen at all, which is a losing game to try to predict. She said that we're actually very, very, very bad predictors of what will and will not happen and how it will happen. And she said the second thing is that we have to believe that when the thing happens, it will be horrible and a tragedy and catastrophic, which also almost never happens. Usually, she said, it's just inconvenient. I don't know how good that advice was or wasn't, but you've been thinking about it a lot. So I just want to remind you 10 years from now, if you've forgotten about it because things have gotten really crazy, that's what she said, and you can give it a try.
That's it for today's show. I would love for you to leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to our show. The Future of Food as You is a production of the Cherry Bomb Podcast Network. Thanks to the team at CityVox Studios, executive producers Kerry Diamond and Catherine Baker, associate producers Jenna, Sadhu, and Elizabeth Vogt, and content operations manager Londyn Crenshaw. Catch you on the Future Flip.